gentlemen, distinguished guests, it's my pleasure and honor to welcome you to the 2017 edition of the Istanbul Development Dialogue. Now, my name is Alican Ayanlar, and as you just saw from the screen up there, I am not a thrill seeker. However, I am a journalist with TRT World, and our media organization tends to deal with some of the newsy aspects of some of the governance, peace building, and the natural disaster problems that this panel will be discussing over the next few days. So I'm very excited to be a part of all this. Now, we all know that the United Nations Development Program has been sort of spearheading the effort to tackling some of the region's biggest problems, whether it be income inequality, poverty, malnutrition, as well as access to communal services. But there are external shocks, let's not be fooled. And some of these shocks pose a serious threat in derailing some of the significant progress that's been made. What are we talking about? We're talking about political instability, social uprisings, not to mention the biggest refugee crisis since World War II. Undoubtedly, all of these have very profound effects on our lives today. And these shocks, all of these shocks, have specific risks to the region's sustainable development. So over the next 2 days, we'll be digging a little deeper into what these risks are, as well as identifying some of the ways to not only reducing the likelihood of these risks reoccurring, but also reducing some of the effects. In other words, resilience. And talking about resilience, I do have to apologize to our audience. I am battling a bit of a cold, which seems to be quite resilient. So if the UNDP has any suggestions, I'm all ears. But kidding aside, the UNDP has worked extremely hard in bringing together some of the most qualified experts, as well as the best possible event. It'll include panel discussions, speeches, presentations, interactive, as well as brainstorming formats. But before we begin, have a couple of reminders. If you do want to stay connected, we do have a network, Wi-Fi network that's available. IDD 2017 is the password. We do have some of our speakers that will be speaking in another language besides English. So if you want to listen into that, or if you feel more comfortable listening into another language, please feel free to pick up some of your headsets that are available outside of the desk. Another reminder is that we'll be, all this information is actually in the little pamphlets that have been distributed. Second and more important reminder, the second D in IDD stands for dialogue, and this is probably one of the most important aspects of this event. We want our audience members, as well as our viewers, to participate as much as possible. So send us your questions using the hashtag IDD or IDD 2017, but we'll also have some time allocated at the end of each panel discussion so you can ask your questions. So let's get started with things. We have three very important speakers here today to deliver some opening comments as well as some keynote addresses. Let's begin with the director of the United Nations Development Program's Regional Bureau for Europe and the CIS, Ms. Cihan Sultanoglu.
Good morning, günaydın, Excellency, Minister of Development of the Republic of Turkey, Minister Elvan, Ms. Clark, UNDP Administrator, Excellencies, distinguished guests, and dear colleagues. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome you to UNDP's third Istanbul Development Dialogues. As you know, and as you have just heard, this year's dialogue focuses on risk and resilience. It's hard to imagine a more important or timely topic for the world in general, and especially for those countries of Eastern Europe and Central Asia whose development aspirations are supported by UNDP. In 2015 and 2016, the dialogues were devoted to inequalities in this region. Eastern Europe and Central Asia contain middle-income countries in which such basic development challenges as income poverty, poor health and nutrition, and access to communal services have been largely resolved. However, favorable trends in average income levels can hide large deviations from otherwise positive development trends, the so-called tyranny of averages. By focusing on inequalities, past years' dialogues provided a platform for research, advocacy, and partnerships to address these disparities. They helped call attention in the region to the no one left behind dimensions of the Sustainable Development Goals and Agenda 2030. They also led last year's publication of UNDP's Regional Human Development Report on Progress at Risk, Inequalities and Human Development in Eastern Europe, Turkey, and Central Asia. Shocks, crises, and other risks to development accomplishments can pose similar threats. People who are living well can suddenly find themselves unable to make ends meet because of natural disasters, macroeconomic shocks, or armed conflict. If inequalities call attention to deviations from favorable average development outcomes today, then risk reflects the chance that individuals who benefit from these outcomes today may not be able to do so tomorrow. Resilience, in turn, refers to efforts to manage these risks and to reduce the impact of the unfavorable events that stand behind them. Moreover, experience from natural disasters, conflict, and other crisis situations shows that women, the elderly, ethnic minorities, people with disabilities, and members of other vulnerable groups often face greater risks to life and livelihoods in such situations. Experience also shows that crisis prevention, risk management, and recovery all work better when they benefit from the engagement of the affected communities, households, and individuals. Effective policy and policy interventions for both crisis prevention and response need to be designed and implemented with these vulnerabilities and possibilities in mind. Here in Turkey, the importance of managing risk and promoting resilience in development work is well recognized. This was apparent in the work of the World Humanitarian Summit hosted in Istanbul last year, and in the 8th summit meeting of the Global Forum on Migration and Development, which was also held in Istanbul in 2015. It is apparent in Turkey's willingness to accommodate almost 3 million refugees, mostly from Syria, in the country. For these and many other reasons, we are so pleased that Minister Elvan is here with us today. Unfortunately, risks to global and regional prospects for sustainable development are growing. The principles of transnational economic integration, national sovereignty, and human rights that have for decades underpinned the international system are today facing new and unexpected challenges. These are apparent in the threats of terrorism and violent extremism, in the migration crisis, in domestic political reactions to growing levels of income and wealth inequalities, and in sharpening tensions around military conflicts in Ukraine, Syria, and elsewhere. In addition to posing new questions for global governance, these trends are blurring conventional divisions between development programming, disaster risk reduction, and emergency humanitarian responses. They are complicating the risk management challenges facing civil society and private companies, as well as by state agencies and international organizations. Thus, they underscore the importance of efforts by all these actors and stakeholders to build resistance against these threats. People who argue that the post-1990 world order is now facing unprecedented difficulties are no longer dismissed as alarmists. The global economic integration that lifted billions of people out of poverty is increasingly faulted for threats to national sovereignty and for the inequalities and environmental stresses it produces. Security frameworks that promise both national sovereignty and protection of human security are coming under immense pressures. These issues are particularly poignant for the countries of Eastern Europe and Central Asia. A number of these economies have never fully recovered from the impact of the global financial crisis of 2008-2009, which was then followed by the Eurozone crisis of 2010-2012, and then the ruble crisis of 2014-2015. The development anchored offered by prospects of accession or integration with the European Union has weakened due to unprecedented pressures. There are deep disagreements about the so-called orthodox background socioeconomic risk management policy advice offered to these countries, and whether the emergence of new actors such as the BRICS Bank, the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank, or the Eurasian Economic Union will change this. Risks of macroeconomic shocks and their possible implications for poverty, inequality, and exclusion are major concerns. With the possible exception of some Western Balkan economies, GDP growth in 2017 in the region is unlikely to significantly exceed population growth. Low commodity prices and slow growth are expected to limit development prospects in resource-dependent economies, as well as in lower middle-income countries that rely on remittances. Conventional measures of social equality and equity like Gini coefficients, gender and development indicators, and social protection coverage may look relatively favorable for the region. However, our Progress at Risk Regional Human Development Report highlights widespread social perceptions of inequalities and corruption before the law. It also highlights the differences in living standards between upper middle-income urban residents with decent jobs and social protection on the one hand, versus less skilled workers laboring in precarious, informal unemployment, increasingly without social protection in smaller towns and rural areas on the other hand. These economic, socioeconomic and political risks in the region are playing out against the backdrop of serious climate and natural disaster risks. Turkey, most of Central Asia and the Caucasus, and parts of Western Balkans face significant earthquake risks. A major seismic event in any one of these countries could generate significant human and economic losses. Our Regional Human Development Report on Risk-Proofing the Western Balkans, which also came out last year, highlights the growing frequency and severity of floods in Southeast Europe. It also points out that vulnerable socioeconomic groups like the Roma, children, the elderly, and people with disabilities are likely to be particularly vulnerable to climate and natural disaster risks. Our report calls attention to the need to engage communities and to build back better once these disasters are over. UNDP is proud to support national efforts to manage these risks. But we know that acting alone, we cannot effect transformative changes in managing risks to sustainable development. It's only through partnerships with other development actors, with the UN system, but also with donors, governments, multilateral development banks, private companies, civil society, and local communities, that we can make some lasting impact. That's why we are so pleased to see so many of our partners here with us today. We are also very pleased to see the strong national ownership of sustainable development goals in the region, especially the social dimensions of the agenda. Aspirations for socially inclusive economic growth are now widely held in the region. Realizing these aspirations, however, will not be easy. It requires whole-of-government approaches that are based on national employment strategies and commitments to close gaps in national social protection systems. It also requires economic growth models that invest in, rather than unsustainably deplete, the region's natural capital. More effective management of climate and natural disaster risk likewise needs to reflect broader, more comprehensive approaches going beyond capacity development. We need holistic, integrated approaches to disaster management and response. The Istanbul Development Dialogues are intended to serve as a platform for taking these issues forward. During the next 2 days, we will hear presentations and commentary by leading global and regional experts on the nature of these risks and how best to respond to them. We will explore progress in building resilience against these risks in the state, private, and third sectors, inter alia, via peace-building activities, social protection reforms, including via the Social Protection Floor Initiative, and policies and programming for managing disaster and climate risks. We will explore how development programming can be aligned with agendas for resilience and disaster risk reduction, climate change, and humanitarian assistance. We will examine how the private sector is taking up these challenges, inter alia via the presentation of the Connecting Business Initiative. I very much look forward to a very interesting discussion. I'm very excited to hear from our keynote speakers and from all of you in the course of the 2 days. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ms. Cihan Sultanoglu. Well, now I'd like to invite the United Nations Development Program's Administrator, Ms. Helen Clark, to deliver the first of the morning's keynote addresses.
Good morning, everybody. Minister of Development of Turkey and senior officials accompanying you, our Regional Director, Cihan Sultanoglu, and Regional Directors also of UNFPA and UN Women, all guests present, which also include many of the UN resident coordinators, UNDP resident representatives from this region. And good to be here to participate in this flagship dialogue series of UNDP's Regional Bureau for Europe and the CIS. The focus, as Cihan has outlined, over the 2 days is on risk and resilience. There's plenty of risks out there, and there's a lot of resilience too. And as development actors, we look at scanning what those risks are and on how we can support risk-informed approaches to development which will sustain progress for people in volatile times. Increasingly, we see around our world that volatility is the new normal and that we can never take for granted either peace and stability, nor economic equilibrium, nor the services provided by nature, all of which are essential for human and sustainable development. Rather, we are living in a world where we must manage around and build resilience to the impacts of so many risks, of conflicts and political tensions which spill far beyond national borders, of economic shocks which originate in one country or region and then have contagious effects, regional and globally, with serious social repercussions. And then there is the damage being done to the global commons, like that done to our climate ecosystem, which is increasing the intensity and the frequency of disasters and impacting on the most vulnerable communities and countries the most. So our world and the region in which we meet are currently witness to all these kinds of shocks and more. And the way in which these shocks overlap is compounding their impacts and increasing vulnerabilities. Conflict, for example, drives down economies and human development and often takes a very heavy toll on the environment as well. Wildlife and forests, for example, are particularly vulnerable in that context. So UNDP brings development perspectives to addressing these challenges, always endeavouring to address the root causes and not just the symptoms, and to supporting communities and countries to build resilience to adverse events. We also advocate for effective multilateralism to address those challenges which no one country can resolve on its own. Indeed, that was always the case for the creation of the multilateral system. It exists to contribute to global public goods and to the protection and management of the global commons. Looking on the bright side, the past couple of years have seen a great burst of agenda setting, which does address how to build peaceful, inclusive, sustainable, and resilient societies. And the longer-term solutions to that quest are to be found in full implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals and Agenda 2030, the Paris Climate Agreement, the Sendai Framework on disaster risk reduction, the new urban agenda from Habitat Conference in Quito last year, and the Addis Ababa Action Agenda on Financing for Development. The question is, in these turbulent times, will there be the global political will and the solidarity required to implement these agendas wholeheartedly? The choice is clear. Our world can work together to find solutions to these shared challenges, or we can see more conflict and the perpetuation of extreme poverty, vulnerability, inequality, and unsustainable development, which taken together have spillover impacts for all of us. I know which side of that equation UNDP will always come down on, dedicated as it is to human development for all and to peaceful, inclusive, and sustainable futures. Therefore, UNDP is enthusiastically supporting the rollout of all these major development-related agendas of the past couple of years and has worked very hard to make its programming relevant to the needs of communities devastated by shocks, including those caused by conflict and severe climate events and other disasters. The aim is to contribute to risk-informed and resilient development and to support those laid low by shocks to build back better afterwards and mitigate against such events in the future. So let me now comment on just 3 areas of UNDP's work in these contexts. Firstly, on building peaceful and resilient societies, on supporting risk-informed development and disaster risk reduction, and on enhancing resilience of communities even in the midst of the most severe crises. Firstly, resilient and sustainable development is premised on peace. Societies need to be able to settle their differences without resort to arms and to be inclusive of all their citizens. Inclusion always has economic, social, and political dimensions, and it's no surprise that societies which lapse into profound conflict are characterized generally to varying degrees by inequity, exclusion, and denial of voice and rights. Development gains without justice will be tenuous. When internal divisions which can't be mediated spill over into outright conflict, decades of gains will be lost very quickly. Witness Syria, which before 2011 was a middle-income country with rising human development, and today has close to half its people displaced, very high levels of poverty, and a high death toll from the conflict. So we need to take a broad view of what sustainable development is, as the 2030 Agenda urges us to do. Yes, it is about eradicating poverty and having better services and infrastructure, but these need to be supplemented by inclusive and responsive governance and the rule of law which underpin long-term stability and lock-in development gains. In my view, democratic governance backed by strong institutions provides the shock absorbers which do enable long-term resilience. This thinking leads UNDP to program around building strong institutions across parliaments, justice, policing, national human rights bodies, and to promote broad participation and voice, including for women and youth and marginalised communities, and by opening up space for civil society and media. Development which rests on such foundations will be more sustainable and resilient, and it is directly encouraged by the new Sustainable Development Goal 16 on building peaceful, just, and inclusive societies. Secondly, on building disaster resilience. So many times every year, we are shocked by the scenes on our television screens of communities devastated by powerful natural forces. Just in relatively recent months, from Hurricane Matthew in Haiti to the very severe earthquakes in Italy, to now the pre-famine conditions declared by the United Nations in 4 countries, and with others experiencing also very severe drought and food insecurity. These kinds of weather-related disasters are set to worsen for decades to come, until measures taken pursuant to the Paris Agreement on climate change succeed in stabilising the climate ecosystem. Meanwhile, we all have work to do to support adaptation to what is happening and to reduce existing disaster risks. And the most vulnerable communities and countries do need a great deal of international support. Risk-informed development, therefore, must be inclusive of climate action and take into account the impact of rapid urbanisation, which results in very significant concentrations of populations, services, governance institutions, and infrastructure, often put at particular risk of major storms and seismic events. The work UNDP is doing in these areas spans support for implementation of both the Paris Climate Agreement and the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. We do have that $2.8 billion climate portfolio spanning adaptation and mitigation action. We have worked to support many countries to prepare their intended nationally determined contributions on climate action for the Paris Conference, and we now support turning these into concrete plans and action. Major funding for climate action partnerships between UNDP and countries is now coming through from the Green Climate Fund, and the Global Environment Facility remains a major supporter of our climate-related work. From Tuvalu to the Maldives to Malawi and more, major Green Climate Fund grants are building resilience to adverse climate events. During the time frame of the previous Hyogo Disaster Risk Reduction Framework, UNDP programmed around $2 billion of work in that area. And now we are seeking to operationalise the successor framework, the Sendai one, with what we're calling our 5-10-50 Partnership Initiative for Risk-Informed Development, aiming to increase disaster risk resilience in 5 critical areas over 10 years in 50 countries. The work we do in these areas has a very strong gender lens, as women and girls are disproportionately vulnerable to climate change and to disasters. Yet all too often, they are excluded from the design and implementation of the relevant policies and plans. It is absolutely vital to bring the voices of women into the planning for early warning systems, disaster responses, and the longer-term recovery. We're very pleased at this dialogue to be welcoming representatives of the insurance sector, because of the vital roles the sector plays in risk-informed development and recovery. The business model for insurance mutualises and spreads risk. Insurers are well placed to help assess how to mitigate around multidimensional risks and shocks. And insurance can also serve as a fast disbursing mechanism, helping those hit by disasters to build back better and reduce risks and costs for the long term. So it's not surprising that the critical role of insurance is recognised, is specified in the new global development agendas. For example, Agenda 2030 explicitly acknowledges insurance as a critical risk management tool. The Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction calls for the promotion of disaster risk transfer and insurance mechanisms. The Addis Ababa Action Agenda on Financing for Development calls for the development of domestic capital markets, particularly long-term bond and insurance markets, to meet longer-term financial needs. and the Paris Climate Agreement called for increased cooperation and facilitation of risk insurance facilities, climate risk pooling, and other insurance solutions. Notwithstanding the obvious benefits of insurance, many continue to be uninsured. Only $27 billion out of the $90 billion in worldwide economic losses recorded in 2015 were insured. Repeat, only $27 billion out of the $90 billion. And this protection gap between insured and uninsured assets is even greater for less wealthy countries and communities. For example, in Nepal, the April 2015 earthquake resulted in $4.8 billion of economic losses, $4.8 billion, of which only $210 million of damages were insured. Typhoon Haiyan, which hit the Philippines in 2013, cost between $6.5 and $14.5 billion, of which only $300 to $700 million were insured. So to address these kinds of challenges of underinsurance, these big gaps, UNDP was part of co-establishing and now co-chairing the Insurance Development Forum, which is a new public-private partnership between the United Nations, the World Bank, and the insurance industry. And this forum is aiming to reduce risks and provide affordable and accessible insurance coverage to the most vulnerable people and countries. We need innovative and lateral thinking in these areas. The third area I want to comment on briefly is enhancing resilience in the midst of crisis. In recent years, protracted crises and the massive forced displacement of people has severely challenged the international community's capacity to respond. In the case of the Syria crisis, which has had such severe spillover impacts into Turkey and other nations near and far, it became apparent that a relief-only approach could not work. UNDP began providing emergency development solutions aimed at enhancing resilience through creating and restoring livelihoods and basic services, working at the local level in Syria and with municipalities and governments in neighbouring countries. This work has gone to scale, including in Syria, despite the obviously immensely difficult security conditions there. Last year alone, we estimate our programming reached more than 2.5 million people in Syria, directly and indirectly, largely through access to basic services and also the creation of tens of thousands of jobs. Some 268,000 tonnes of solid waste and debris were removed from sites of major war damage in Homs, Malula, and Aleppo. In Lebanon, delivery of basic services was improved in 126 vulnerable municipalities last year with UNDP support. More than 1 million people were beneficiaries of that. And again, tens of thousands more Lebanese and Syrians, many of them women and young people, benefited from job creation and support for small-scale entrepreneurship. In Jordan, we've worked with partners in 15 municipalities most affected by the Syrian crisis, improving waste management, installing electricity solar panels, rebuilding public buildings and spaces. And again, we're looking at the many thousands of people benefiting from employment training, support for business development and job creation. Hundreds of beneficiaries have established their own micro-businesses with UNDP support. In Turkey, I want to acknowledge the incredible commitment which the government of this country made from the outset of the Syrian crisis to supporting the Syrian refugees who reached Turkey. By comparison, the efforts of any of the rest of us are modest. But in our small way, we have worked to mobilise support for municipalities which have received very large numbers of Syrian refugees, especially in areas like expanding and improving waste management services. We've been active on opportunities for vocational and Turkish language training for Syrian refugees, along with support for creating jobs and livelihoods for both refugees and members of local host communities. And let me acknowledge also that Turkey was a first mover in this sub-region in allowing refugees to seek work legally. One of the most basic elements of resilience is the ability to support your family. And if you can work, you're halfway to starting to meet that objective for self-reliance and for dignity. What we have learned from the approach we have developed to the crisis in Syria and its spillover effects, we've now been able to apply across Libya, Iraq, and Yemen. We have set up designated stabilization facilities for Libya and Iraq, which have attracted very significant funding. In the case of Iraq, we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars of funding coming into the UNDP stabilization facility. And in that country, as Islamic State, so-called, is removed from towns and cities, the facility is drawn on to support restoration of the local economy and services and remove the debris of war. The sooner people can get back home, the local markets can operate again, people can get their small business going, the faster is the return to self-reliance for those whose lives have been severely disrupted. In Libya, the stabilisation facility we created is funding infrastructure rehabilitation, including of schools and hospitals. An example, in the middle of recent major power outages, including in Tripoli and Benghazi, which are major cities, UNDP brought in the essential equipment like ambulances and backup power systems to prevent the collapse of the health services. And 9 hospitals servicing approximately 500,000 people directly benefited from that support and were able to carry on operating. In Yemen, close to 8 million people benefited directly and indirectly from UNDP's work on resilience last year. And it included renovation of damaged community infrastructure, solid waste and debris removal, providing critical assets like solar water pumps and greenhouses to boost agricultural production. I'm pleased to say that this work we're doing in Yemen is now being scaled up through a major partnership with the World Bank. $300 million in IDA finance are being channeled through UNDP now to support cash for work programs, public services, and infrastructure repair in Yemen. So, to conclude, there are a lot of challenges out there to sustainable development, and our world, unfortunately, is not providing a stable and level playing field on which to build progress. We need then to acknowledge all the risks. We need to navigate around them, endeavour to address the root causes where we can, and adapt where we can't. UNDP believes that if development is not risk-informed, it cannot be sustainable development because it will not last. And where risks materialise, as with the outbreak of severe conflict or with major weather and seismic disasters, UNDP will be there to enhance the resilience of people to cope and to protect development gains to the best extent we can. With those few words, I wish you all stimulating and productive sessions at these dialogues, and thank you all for participating. Thank you.
And to top off the opening remarks section, I'd like to invite the Minister for Development for the Republic of Turkey, Mr. Lütfi Elvan. Sayın Bakanım.
Her Excellency Helen Clark, Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, at the outset, I would like to welcome you all to Istanbul and express my thanks and appreciations for coming to Turkey for this important event from different countries of the world. Today, we gathered here to discuss an important topic which takes place among most essential factors for designing development activities in the near future: risks and resilience. I would also like to thank UNDP and UNDP Istanbul office authorities for choosing this topic as this year's theme of Istanbul Development Dialogue. Istanbul Development Dialogues is a good example of an innovative tool for participatory development, which is an essential aspect for policy design, both at national level and at the global level, for a better future for all humanity. As the government of Republic of Turkey, we attach utmost importance to participatory approach in the area of cooperation for development. Moreover, we usually support and collaborate with the international development organizations to conceptualize new ideas and to make policy formulations for welfare of the people. Dear guests, resilience is ability to recover our social, political, and economic systems from both expected and unprecedented negative risks, especially disasters. The importance of disasters in development policies is increasing due to its effects on all sectors by increasing the costs of economic, social, and physical infrastructure. Nowadays, unfortunately, there are numerous disasters and crises around, either man-made or natural. As sudden shocks, disasters, and crises may spoil positive environments, and their negative effects may even cause a total loss of confidence in the governmental agencies, loss of confidence in the society, if we cannot adopt timely and efficient precautions. I firmly believe that there is a great scope for cooperation and learning from each other, among ourselves in this important domain. As the Republic of Turkey, we always stand ready to share our experiences and learn from other countries in a full spirit of cooperation. With this perspective, now I would like to share some salient points from our experience in this field. Turkey's main goal on disaster management is to take into consideration disaster risks in macroeconomic, sectoral, and spatial planning processes to raise awareness and resilience against disasters. As a result of natural disaster reduction works in Turkey, the Urban Transformation Law, which sets out the principles and procedures for improvement, clearance, and renewal to constitute healthy and safe living environments in disaster risks areas, was announced in 2012. After adoption of the Urban Transformation Law, almost 12,000 hectares of land was declared as risky areas. This law envisages almost 2.5 billion Turkish liras expenditures and investment through urban transformation financing. Distinguished participants, as you all know, India Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction 2015-2030 was adopted at the Third World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction. India Framework gives opportunities to the countries to identify modalities of cooperation based on commitments to implement a post-2015 framework for disaster risk reduction. The main goal of Sindia framework is to prevent new and existing disaster risks through the implementation of integrated and inclusive economic, social, and environmental policies, and to increase preparedness for response and recovery, and thus strengthen resilience. In order to reach this goal, we are preparing national disaster strategy to be used as a guide in conducting disaster risk mitigation, response, and post-disaster recovery works in coherence. I would like to mention here that there is a significant interconnection between natural disasters and climate change. Considering increased natural disasters all over the world, all nations need to prioritize the works of disaster risk reductions and increase efforts to remove the negative effects of climate change. Turkey have some experiences on the said negative impacts of climate change and challenges regarding international negotiation processes. Our country is one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change. Turkey gives special attention to adopt immediate measures for climate change. Dear guests, Ministry of Development of Turkey, as the responsible body for macroeconomic plans, programs, and projects, is supporting climate change-related policies and projects. Projects for adaptation to climate change on water resources management, agriculture and food, forestry, natural disasters, and ecosystem services are prioritized in Turkey. On the other hand, Paris Agreement, that is a New Deal climate actions, was adopted in December 2015. Before the agreement adopted, Turkey submitted its intended nationally determined contribution in order to support new climate regime. Turkey's expectations during the implementation of Paris Agreement are mainly twofold. There is a need for taking into consideration the national circumstances and responsibilities which should be allocated in a fair and equitable manner. Paris Agreement requires low carbon development strategies. This issue is under consideration among developed and developing country partners through different perspectives. After the Paris Agreement entered into force, Turkey is closely following the positions and policies of both developed and developing countries in terms of their approaches to low carbon development. Turkey is planning to consider carrying low carbon development discussion during coming National Development Plan process. Dear participants, sustainable development concept has a long history in Turkish policy on environment. It has been reflected to numerous laws, regulations, and action plans in a variety of fields and sectors. In this context, Turkey has made significant progress in achieving Millennium Development Goals over the last 15 years. Turkey is among the top 10 performers in achieving MDGs, especially eradicating extreme poverty, reducing child mortality, improving maternal health, ensuring environmental sustainability. In transition from MDGs to Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, Turkey has significantly improved social protection expenditures and elimination of poverty. The absolute poverty rate has decreased significantly in the last decade. Poor individuals living below $4.3 per day was 30.3% in the year 2002. This figure has dropped significantly to 1.5 in the year 2015. We wish to continue this success in obtaining SDGs with the same pace. 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development offers an ambitious framework that urges countries to take actions at all levels. This new global agenda provides a unique opportunity for countries not only to integrate sustainable development policies into their national policy frameworks, but also to deal with global challenges. In the implementation of SDGs, Turkey has determined to take necessary actions for the achievement of sustainable development by 2030. In line with the principle ensuring that no one is left behind, Turkey promotes inclusiveness at both national and international endeavors. As one of the 22 volunteering countries, Turkey presented its national reviews on SDGs at UN High-Level Political Forum last July. Our national voluntary review report, under the coordination of our Ministry of Development, has considered all valuable cooperation with all stakeholders. Through all these attempts, Turkey demonstrated its political ownership, dedication, and leadership at this initial stage of the implementation of the SDGs as well. Our National Development Plan sets out all macro-level national policies and priorities in the context of sustainable development as well. I would like to mention that a preliminary analysis revealed that there is a high consistency between the 10th Development Plan and the SDGs. We will take necessary actions for the achievement of SDGs by 2030 in line with our National Development Plan. We are currently in the stage of preparing long-term vision of the 11th Development Plan. Ministry of Development of Turkey has started a project, namely Stock Taking of SDGs in Turkey in February 2017. In this project, Turkey determines the existing situation with regards to SDGs in order to implement SDG targets that nationally appropriate to find the policy, project, and indicator gaps, and to develop policy proposals for overcoming these gaps. Turkey is firmly dedicated to take action for the effective implementation of the SDGs with effective participation of all partners. Our country will intensify its efforts for cooperation and engage in a wide range of stakeholders, including academia, social society organizations, and private sector at local, national, and international level. One of the goals of SDGs, achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls, is also a priority area for our country in line with the no one left behind principle. Mainstreaming gender equality in our policies and programs and increase the efficiency of the implementation of relevant regulations and strategies is our main goal for achieving gender equality. Our efforts on increasing the participation of women in labor force and decision-making positions, eliminating all kinds of violence against women, in short, empowering women will continue. Role of governments in this regard is coordination of all actors, including public sector, private sector, non-governmental organizations, and universities, besides fulfilling basic responsibilities. Ladies and gentlemen, risks do not occur only because of natural disasters. Social risks are considerably important, like managing natural disaster risks. Since the beginning of Syrian crisis in 2011, Turkey has faced a refugee crisis, and we opened our borders to Syrian people affected from the crisis and accepted them as our guests. Now, Turkey hosts approximately 3 million Syrian people, and our expenditure so far has reached 25 billion US dollars accordingly. We did not only provide shelter to our guests, but also provided and still providing development services in education, health, infrastructure, and so on sectors, with the understanding that keeping our Syrian guests' well-being for a better future for them is our top priority. Our support to Syrian guests is an example of an economic sacrifice. 25 billion US dollars is not a small amount, even considered for an investment budget of a big country such as Turkey. In fact, we are transferring our national resources, which would have been invested in our economy, for the sake of our Syrian friends, who are victims of a regional conflict. More importantly, our support is not just about transfer of financial resources. At the same time, all the relevant ministries, institutions, NGOs spend considerable amount of their energy for the well-being of the Syrian people, which is beyond expression in monetary figures. It is very upset to see that our colleagues in Europe are not following the same tendency with us. Before concluding, I would like to reiterate that in analyzing risks and establishing resilience is not only the responsibility of public sector, but also participation of all stakeholders, such as private sector, NGOs, universities, and other institutions. In addition, we are all aware that risks do not occur just within national boundaries, also appear at transboundaries. Thus, effectively collaboration between governments against social and natural risks is necessary if we look forward for a better future. Distinguished participants, I would like to thank again for your kindness to participate in this important event. I wish a fruitful and effective dialogue meeting. I thank you.
Some eye-opening remarks there. I'd like to thank Ms. Cihan Sultanoglu, Ms. Helen Clark, and Minister Lütfi Elvan for these remarks. Let's take a short break now. We have some tea and coffee ready for you outside in the foyer. Please do enjoy. Also, a quick reminder, we have a series of short-form documentaries as well as film screenings which will be showing up in the Idea Room over the next 2 days. So if you do have a chance, please do check it out. Enjoy the break. We'll see you back here at the bottom of the hour, 10:30. Thank you.